Hey everybody, Omi here from Indus Vienna. So I am a HEMA instructor and I've been teaching a Messer course for the past year. It's been a hugely rewarding experience just seeing the progress with my students and getting to try out a lot of stuff and advancing, of course, my own understanding of the sources, right? So what I did back then is I made a short podcast episode giving the context that I think you should have when you start out your Messer journey. And yeah, now I'm just making a video version of this, hoping to make it accessible for more people. Anyway, so let's dive right into it. What is a Messer? Materially speaking, it is a one-handed, single-edged weapon, sword, I should say, that is in the range of somewhere between 70 centimeters to almost a meter long, although I do have to say that most modern reproductions are in the longer end of this spectrum. And in terms of, very shortly, in terms of historical context, I will expand upon that. It used to be a very popular fencing weapon and a weapon for self-defense during the whole span of the 15th century in the whole German-speaking world. And I have an example here, which is my Landsknecht Emporium Messer. Now this one is a sharp, and we do not use sharp swords in training or sharp blades of any kind because we pay a lot of attention to each other and we want to stay happy and healthy with our training partners. This is just here as an illustration. And as you can see, the hilt is constructed very much as you would expect from a kitchen knife. It has the tang, which is the full width here, and then you have these 1, 2, 3, 4 beautiful rivets holding the wooden slabs on the side here. In addition to that, you have a nagel or nail, which goes out here perpendicular to the crossguard, and you'd have it at the back of your hand protecting here. Now how did it come to that? That is, at least in my interpretation of things, you feel free to dispute me, that is remains of the fact that the Messer is derived from a utility knife. Because as you can imagine, maybe the knives that people used to carry around towards the end of the Middle Ages, they used them also to prepare meat, to open up animals. And if you stab your knife into a deer, for example, well, there might be some bone in the way, some unexpected resistance, and then you want something that stops your hand from gliding off of the hilt and onto the blade, and you're cutting yourself. Well, one very easy way to achieve that is to just drive a nail through the hilt where you would want your hand to be stopped. And you can see a lot of historical examples which have the nail but do not have a crossguard, where I would say it's very obvious that those were not intended for fencing. If they were used for fencing, that is a whole another story. And yeah, there we're already getting into how they were used. One important thing to mention as well, right, I should not forget that is, it is a single-edged sword, but the spine of the blade, the back, is usually sharpened in the forward third up to half of it. So which still allows us to do back edge cuts, which we're making use of in our fencing style. Now I do mostly Leckküchner, and I will get more into what that means in a second. First, we're going to have to mention, how did that happen? Like, how did it become so popular? It's just one type of sword. Well, for this, actually there are quite a number of theories going around the internet. One of them being that, or like, let's just go overview. They involve mostly one guild being more influential and powerful than the others. You know, swordsmiths guild versus knife makers guild or stuff like that. I have so far not found any sources that would support this, but what we do know that is, well, generally speaking, the cities in the German-speaking world towards the end of the Middle Ages were organized in, they had guilds, which were quite powerful and influential, and the craftspeople in these guilds well, they enjoyed power, but they also had some duties and responsibilities, and one of them was the Wehrpflicht in German, a modern translation of which would be military duty, but a more literal translation is a duty of weapons, or a duty of owning a weapon. And we do actually have documents of people at the time being punished for not owning a weapon. Because, right, if you were part of a guild and you wanted to enjoy a certain standing in your city, well, you might be called up for, night watch, something like that. You would have to bring a weapon, or in the worst of cases, if your city is under siege, you might actually be called to arms. And in that case, if you didn't have a weapon at hand, well, that would be very embarrassing to you and to the guild. So that means we have there at the time this class of people who were in the need for weapons, and I can definitely see how a certain number of them saw it as an opportunity to show off their wealth and buy themselves fancy swords. But not everybody obviously had the same means or the same desire even. And that's where it comes in, that looking at weapons of the same length, a single-edged sword is easier to construct than a double-edged sword. That goes into blade geometry, where I think that there are much more qualified people on YouTube to tell you about that. But generally speaking, just to give you a rough idea, the important thing is the distance between the thickest point of the blade and the edge of the blade. And when you have a single-edged sword that's like about 4 centimeters wide at the base, well, that distance is then 4 centimeters, and you have a very gradual, wedge that you can use for cutting. If you look at a double-edged sword, then with the same width, then this distance, because the spine of the blade is in the middle, halves. So the edge over here gets a lot wider if you want to have the same thickness of spine, and you do want to have a stiff blade to allow for effective thrusting. So that is, for me, what makes the most sense in why this weapon started to be so widespread. And from there we see a tradition developing between those, like, I would say it's a commoner's tradition that was lived at the same time as the Lichtenauer tradition, the noble tradition of longsword fencing. And those are, even though they exist at the same times, they are in many aspects opposed to each other. You can see as well, there's a great illustration of a fighting scene that depicts people fighting with messers and other types of weapons, where it says above it, "Haust du mich, so stich ich dich." If you hew at me, I will stab you. Which kind of illustrates the idea that in the commoner society of the time, hacking at somebody and stabbing somebody were two wildly different things, because, well, everybody has these weapons, and apparently it was very widely accepted in society that if two people have a quarrel, it escalates up to the point where they swing messers at each other. But obviously a strike or a hew is much less deadly than stabbing somebody. So as soon as somebody tried to stab the other, that actually escalated it further, because then they showed their intent to kill the other person. That actually had some legal implications, is something I heard from a very well-informed historian, very knowledgeable historian by the name of Rob Brooks. You should really look him up if you're interested. Anyways, so from this, you can see that we get a commoner's tradition where you have a lot of strikes, and stabbing was not as accepted, let's call it that. And then you have, at the same time, this noble tradition, the Lichtenauer tradition, where the first thing we learn from the manuscripts is a Zornhau, and then just thrusting right to the face of the other guy. So you can see there's a really stark difference between the two. And at this point, towards the end of the 15th century, is where we get a priest by the name of Johannes Leckküchner. He studied law and theology in Heidelberg and Leipzig. And during this time, apparently he came into contact with both of these traditions, the noble tradition and the commoner's traditions. And what he did was he went ahead and made a synthesis, applying the principles of the longsword tradition of Lichtenauer to the Messe. And in my opinion, this worked beautifully. It is such a wealth and such a great source. And also, as far as I can tell, obviously he was a learned man. So he could read and write himself. He just sat down and wrote down until he was out of ideas, as opposed to other people who were limited by the fact that they had to hire people for that kind of stuff. So what we get from that is over 430 pages of these techniques. And you can still feel that at some points, there's some points in there, in the system, where the two traditions are at odds with each other. One of those being one of the principal guards, which is the Lugensland, where you have the Messe very high up above your head, which, yes, does exist in longsword to a lesser extent, but here we have it as a principal guard. And later on in the book, it's pretty much dropped in favor of bringing the Messer up to your shoulder. Now, my personal interpretation of that is that it comes from this commoner's tradition, because if you have the Messer up here, you're limiting yourself to strikes from above. You can not very effectively thrust from this position, whereas if you have the Messer on your shoulder, you can very much thrust from here. So you can see in this commoner's tradition, that wouldn't be an issue, but now all of a sudden, since we're bringing those two traditions together, it does create this issue where why is it a principal guard if then in the latter part of the book it's not mentioned that much? So there's some kind of friction over there, but overall he has done an amazing job, and it is just such a wealth that is to be explored. So yeah, I hope I have given you some context. I will leave you with a quote from Rob Brooks, who once said, Leckküchner is PhD level Messer fencing. So if what I said made you excited to jump into it and to try and read some Leckküchner, be prepared, it's heckin' complicated. So if you want to start with some other sources, I can give you some pointers. If you want to start with Leckküchner, go for it. It is incredibly rewarding once you have done your legwork. All right. Well, I hope that with that, you're getting up, you're on your way to your next Messer training, and see you later. Bye.